Welcome to another Pogchamps 3 recap video. We're looking at the game between Logic and Tubbo today. Let's go. So Logic started with white pieces, and he goes for e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, the Italian game. And we have a very symmetrical variation. And we get to this position where knight to g4 is played by Tubbo. He goes very aggressive, targeting this f2 square. And here, bishop to g5 is played, attacking the queen, and queen takes g5. So a very weird blunder here by Tubbo. I think maybe what happened is that often if there's a piece here and there's a knight and a queen, there's that relationship of a pin, so the knight cannot take. But of course, this is not a bishop, this is a knight. So that pin does not exist, and so queen takes is just a massive blunder. The knight can take, and you're not losing your own queen here. And so immediately Logic gets a very nice advantage, and not only does he win the queen for the bishop, but he also has a very easy type of attack, a very nice way to continue applying pressure and continuing to win more and more material. So the game continued here with knight takes f2, queen to f3, knight takes on h1, and now bishop takes on f7. The king has to move to d8, and although there isn't necessarily a very clear checkmating idea here, somehow the king is somewhat safe here. Obviously, this square is blocked by the pawn. You still have great ways to attack, such as bishop to h5, making room for the knight to come in and do a fork. So there are plenty of ways for you to continue going here. In this game, we have knight to d5, bishop comes to e7, knight takes, knight takes. So obviously, if you're up material, you want to trade down. So Logic does a good job here trading, and he castles, gets his king safe. You never want to forget about your own king safety, even if it seems like that doesn't matter, like he can't attack you. Things can change very quickly, so you definitely don't want to forget that. And now it gets a little bit tricky, because if you move the bishop, you lose your queen, and so here knight takes on h7 was played, trying to move that rook away from this square, so that pin is no longer there, and all of your pieces feel a bit better here. The queen now moves to h5, but by doing so, Logic is getting in another pin. The knight no longer can move. The knight can finally retreat back, and it finds itself in a square here, but the queen can just take it. But the one thing about this square is it's eyed by the bishop, and so even though the knight was lost, it does maybe, it maybe was kind of setting up a trap that later in the game you could potentially play d5 and hope that Logic misses the fact that the bishop is going to be attacking the queen, because it won't be necessarily so obvious. Here, the rook takes the knight, the bishop drops back, and it's setting up a very beautiful idea here. There's actually already a threat of checkmate, and so after d6, there is this threat of checkmate, and this is actually a checkmate in one. So Logic here does see the checkmate in one, and he moves his rook all the way here, but he does a misclick, and he goes to f7. It's very unfortunate, because of course he saw this checkmate, and if he did this, he would have been in a great shape. However, instead he goes here, which not only is it not checkmate, but it actually loses the queen, because the pawn moved here, and the bishop suddenly hits the queen. And so it's a very quick turn of events, and suddenly black is the one who is even better here. And it's crazy what happened. Of course, white still has some great compensation. You can take the rook here, and later you have ideas of maybe going for this. In this case, Logic wins this rook, but black is just much better here. And if you're in a worse position, you definitely need to find some sort of counterplay, and that could be trying to promote a pawn. So Logic does a great job here of recognizing that he has a nice pawn majority here, right? If we're looking at these three files of the board, there's a 3v2 pawn majority. So if you start pushing the pawns here, potentially good things could happen, and you have nothing to lose. So definitely, if you're in a position where you've blundered material, maybe you're down material, stick to the areas of the board where you might have still an advantage, and look to convert that. And in this case, he does a pretty nice move here, not taking back. Of course, taking was possible. Black is still winning regardless of what you do. But the idea with pushing is trying to then push again and take advantage of this pin, and then use this open file. If he took, the rook is suddenly blocking the pawn. It's still possible to promote this pawn eventually, but the idea here is that it seems a bit more straightforward. You're just going to push the pawn 4 times, so that might have been the thought process going in Logic's head. And that's exactly what he tries to do, and here he actually does that. And although if knight takes here and then pawn takes, although black still has quite a lot of pieces for the pawn, suddenly white has managed to get some compensation, and it's not so clear, who's necessarily going to win this game. However, in the game, instead of taking the rook here, because there's not really a way to stop the promotion, so your best bet is probably to just take the rook, we have rook to g1, which is kind of setting up a trap. Because if the king moves to d2, then suddenly rook to b1 is going to stop the promotion, and black is just destroying white in this position. However, the king does come to d2, but Tubbo misses this idea and just moves the rook up one more square. This is also setting up a little trap, because king to e3 is actually checkmate in this position. So there were many areas where white could have made a mistake or maybe did make a mistake, but in the end it ended up working well, because here the king had to just move, because I think what happened is that Tubbo didn't realize this idea of swinging the rook over, so he just imagined this repetition, and of course he doesn't want to draw here, which is why he decides to not do this check and instead move the king here, but by doing so he blunders this promotion. And now, not only did white get a queen, but white's actually even better, because this knight no longer has the ability to take the rook because of the pin. And so this has turned very quickly, and immediately white is just much better. In fact, here there's already a checkmate, here, and this is indeed checkmate. So there was a checkmate here. Logic missed it, but, at the same time, it's important that, he didn't rush to try to find the checkmate, because this square is covered, this square is covered, this square is covered. So there were many areas for him to make a mistake. So I think it's completely acceptable that he just, in the end, went for this pawn instead of finding this line. But, that would have been a very cool checkmate. And he gets another opportunity to do it here, but instead he just takes the pawn, which is a little bit worse, because what happens is if you take the pawn and he moves the king, of course you have checkmate. But if you take the pawn, he can now take your rook. Because when you did this check, this came with check, so he couldn't take your rook. He had to move the king into checkmate. But here, this no longer comes with check, and so in the end, knight takes the rook, queen takes, and it's still not necessarily winning for either player. It's still completely up in the air. However, here the queen is hitting the rook, and I think when it comes to beginner level games, you prefer to have a queen because it's much easier to use a queen instead of having a rook and another piece. The queen just works very well alone, whereas, having to use a rook and another piece together is quite tricky. And so already here, Tubbo blunders the rook, but Logic does not see it. Instead, he takes a pawn, but then in this position, he goes ahead, he does this beautiful fork, wins the rook, and with this, he kind of wins the game. The last thing I will mention, though, is that in this position, right here, he had the opportunity to push the pawn, and after takes, of course, this is just winning, but it kind of seemed to me like he was scared to go into an endgame where he was just a queen versus a king. Maybe he doesn't feel fully confident with this, because instead of going for this very obvious idea, he decides to bring his king in this position, which is obviously still winning, and in the end he uses two queens to do a checkmate. But I feel like it was kind of interesting that he decided not to go into that line where he just simplifies the position and in the end has an extra queen. So maybe that is because of lack of confidence, maybe it's for a different reason. Regardless, he wins the first game. Let's move on to game 2. So in game 2, Tubbo has the white pieces. We have e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to c4, and now d6. White castles quickly, but gets pinned. And so often, a little tip here, whenever black pushes this pawn to be able to develop this bishop, if you're worried about your knight getting pinned, because often that can be very annoying, you can very easily just push h3, and this is something that I like to do. It might seem like you're wasting a move, but h3 also has the very long-term purpose of stopping any back rank checkmate ideas. So once your king castles and it's here, if this pawn's on h2, very, very long-term, once everything trades and stuff, and maybe they have a rook or a queen, they'll be able to do a back rank checkmate. But with your pawn on h3, it also gives you that kind of air room for your king, and you might be able to escape if that ever happens. So h3 is a multi-purpose move, and in general, it's a very cool resource to stop the pin from happening. However, in this game, white castles and allows the pin to happen, which isn't the biggest deal. You have ways to get around this pin. For example, putting your knight on d2 to try to relieve some of the pressure. Maybe at some point you can push d4 and put your queen on d3 where it still defends the knight. You could even try h3 and g4, although that could be very exposing to your king. So there are methods, and of course you can bring the bishop back, but that might waste some tempo. We have d3 here. The knight immediately comes and applies pressure to this other knight. And like I mentioned, there are ways for white to try to get out of this pin. So whenever you have a pin, try to use it as quickly as you can, because chances are your opponent's going to be able to try to escape from that pin pretty quickly. So a pin is a very temporary thing, so try to take advantage of it. So knight to d4 is a very strong choice here. We have bishop to g5, which if you've done chess.com puzzles, you probably know is a pretty big blunder. You have this very cool resource, bishop takes f3, attacking the king, attacking the queen, counterattacking the queen. So if bishop takes, you can take the other queen, and in the end, you've simply won material in this line. So here, Tubbo does blunder, but Logic doesn't find it, which makes sense because it's not an easy and intuitive thing to find. Of course, your queen's attacked, and that's all you're thinking of. So trying to take a different piece on a different position, on a different portion of the board seems ridiculous. But you should try to consider this, because the idea is the knight is the only defender for the bishop. So if you can get away with taking it with tempo, that could be pretty cool. And so that would have been a pretty nice option here. We have knight to f6, we have knight to d2, and now h6, the bishop hops back. We have c3, the trade of knights, and finally h3 and d4. But you have to be careful when pushing pawns in your center that you don't drop other pawns in the center. So finally, knight takes on e4, and not only is your knight no longer attacked by the bishop, but suddenly black is actually attacking this other bishop. So pins are also something, another thing about pins, they can kind of churn and flip on the person having the pin. So here, it kind of seems like white is controlling this diagonal with this pin. It's not really a pin anymore, but white seems to have the control here. But once the knight moves, black is also threatening this bishop here. So that's another thing to note about pins. They can kind of flip around, and in fact, black does take this piece. And even though you did just trade, look at how open this king is. This king has some very nice shelter. This king is wide open on the g-file, so you might be able to eventually get a rook here. You might be able to eventually just use your knight and maybe take this pawn, perhaps move the knight to this square here. So you have ways in this position to attack this open king. And f4 is a pretty necessary move here because you need to defend the square from this attack. So f4 defends that square because the rook suddenly can see that square. But note that f4 also takes away the control on the g3 square. And so Logic had the opportunity to just go for the draw here by repetition. And of course, this would have been very good for him because all he needed is a draw in order to win the whole match because he won the first game. So that would have been a pretty cool option he could have gone with. But in the game, that's not what he did. Instead, he did this first check, but then he went for the attack. And to me, it seems pretty reasonable why he would do this. It seems like black is completely crushing here, and he might not want to go for the draw because it kind of seems like he's not fulfilling the most that he could. But the problem with this is that although the knight is kind of pressuring the king, it's very stranded here. And if you notice, a lot of the squares that the knight might want to go back to are actually under control by white. And so queen to f3, and after this queen trade, this knight is trapped. White's going to win this knight, and white's going to be completely back in the game. So in this position, you have to be very careful. But unfortunately for Tubbo, he does not find this move and instead blunders a piece. There's this queen trade that happens. The rook comes to the center file, and now rook to d2, which is a very questionable move by Logic. He's just giving away the knight for free, and maybe he's trying to distract the king away from this pawn and then promote. But if that's the case, he completely miscalculated because there's no actual great way to go ahead and promote this pawn. If you go for this idea of putting the rook here and if takes then takes, well, white's just going to take here. That idea works very good if the king is here because white cannot take because of the pin. But in this position, white's just going to take your pawn and you're completely busted. So it's actually very hard to take this pawn and promote it. And so white's completely back in the game here. The rook comes behind the pawn. And if we're talking about looking to promote the pawn, black has a very clear goal now because he got the rook behind the pawn. He has this idea of putting the rook here, and the rook won't be able to take the pawn because it's defended. But this is a very easy idea to stop as white. Simply going rook to d7, stopping the rook from infiltrating. is a great method, and that's exactly what Tubbo does. So a really cool find here. He manages to trade off, and suddenly white's even better here in this beautiful endgame, although it probably is just a draw. We have this trade that happens here, and in the end, white actually finds a really dangerous passed pawn. This pawn here, it's completely free. There's nothing that can stop it, and he just starts to push it. And here actually Logic blunders, and he goes rook to a7. Obviously, he's attacking the pawn, but the pawn is just gonna push and make a queen. And in this position, obviously, it's completely game over. He could resign here, but obviously he doesn't do that. You know, in Pogchamps, definitely, specifically in Pogchamps, never resign because it's never over in Pogchamps. So here he continues playing, and I'll just go through the moves. Basically, white is trying to take away the final pieces that black has here, but there was one final really cool thing that I want to show you in this position, which is rook to c2. If you notice, the queen and the rook together are completely cutting off any square that the king could go to, and also the king stopping this square. And so this king is kind of in stalemate if it weren't for this rook. So there's a really cool idea, rook to c2, wherever the king goes, rook to c1, and this is stalemate. So it's just a very cool method that black could have used here, but Logic doesn't find it. Instead, he blunders the rook, and even though you might say, okay, let's move on, we get how this ends, nope, in Pogchamps, you never know how it ends. It ended as a stalemate. King to f3 was played here, and Logic wins the whole match because he drew the final game. Very disappointing result for Tubbo. Make sure you, in the comments down below, you let me know who you wanted to win this game. Thank you guys so much for watching. Subscribe if you're new around here, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.